So we have a working switch now. When I click or tap this, the toggle moves back and forth, but it looks super dorky because it's just jerking back and forth. We want our switch to animate smoothly between these two positions. Luckily, Framer gives us some tools to easily add some nice animations to our components. So what's happening here is every time I change the value of the xpos variable, we're immediately switching the position of the toggle to that new value. We want to tell the toggle not to immediately change position, but to animate itself to that new value. So instead of just setting this X position directly on the toggle frame, I want to use the property on the frame element called animate. The animate property expects me to give it an object that contains the properties and values that I want to animate. So even though I only want to animate one property, the X property, I still need to put it inside of an object. So the property name, X, is the key, and the value is the value that I want to set that property to. Now remember, an object always gets wrapped in curly braces, and we also have to wrap our JSX property values in curly braces. So we end up with this weird set of double curly braces. It looks weird at first, but it totally makes sense. The outer set is the same as any of these other properties, where we have to wrap the value in braces, and then the inner set is just because this value is an object, which just happens to also use curly braces for its notation. So now that I'm sending this X property with its value as an object to the animate property of the frame, when I click my switch, now the toggle animates nicely back and forth. So this is sort of a springy animation that Framer gives you by default. I find it's a little too bouncy for most things. It's easy to customize this animation, but we'll just leave it as is for now. It's fine. So this is doing the same thing that we were doing before. It's setting the X property of the frame to whatever the current value of our xpos variable is, but instead of just setting it directly like we were doing before, we're telling Framer that we want to animate to the new value whenever this changes. And it's pretty cool that you can get all that just by moving this property into the animation block. Now, our toggle is animating, but I also want to change the color of the background and the border color of the background frame when the switch toggles. And just like the X position, both of those are properties that I want to persist when the component re-renders. So one approach might be to add two new state variables using the useState hook. So one for background color and one for border color. Then I'll need to add those to the animate property for the background frame. And also remember to update both of those in my tap handler using their setter functions. And that does work. There's nothing really wrong with doing it this way, but boy, it would start to be a pain if I had 5 or 6 or 10 visual attributes that I wanted to change every time I click. So in general, you should be wary whenever it feels like you're having to add a lot of state to your component, if you're having to do this a lot inside of one of your components. Because while this works just fine, having to keep track of these 3 state variables for just a simple switch is making me think there might be a better way to do this. And in fact, I can remove all 3 of these and just have one state variable. Instead of trying to store the visual properties individually, it makes more sense to store the overall, the state of the component, and then derive the visual properties from that state. So I only really need to store a single Boolean variable that tells me whether the switch is on or not. So I'm going to remove all 3 of those, all of this logic, and I will briefly remove the animate blocks on my frames just to get back to a blank slate. And now I can create a single state variable called isOn. By default, its value will be false, and then in our handle tap function, we will toggle the state of that variable based on its current state. So if it's currently on, we'll set it to false, otherwise we'll set it to true. And now since my component will re-render whenever this state variable changes, I can create my objects for animation and visual properties based on the current value of my isOn variable. So I'll start with the animation object for my toggle frame. So I'm creating this variable called toggle animation, and if my state variable isOn is true, then I will set that toggle animation variable to this object, which sets my X property to 32. Otherwise, if isOn is false, I will set that variable to this object, which sets my X property to 0. And then I can pass this entire object to the animate property and it will animate like before. It's kind of hard to see without the background styling, but now my toggle is animating again. Now I need to create a separate object for the animation properties for my background frame, but it's basically the same as what I did here. I create a variable to hold the object, and then I set the object with different visual properties depending on the value of my state variable. This time I want to animate the background color and the border properties. And again, I just need to set that object as the animate property for my background frame. And now when I click, I get a nice animation of my toggle moving back and forth. I also get the background color and this 1 pixel border around the background animating as well. So this is pretty nice. I like that it separates out these animation objects from the JSX. It makes things a little cleaner. But it could start to get a little messy if I had more than 2 states here that I want to animate between. So Framer has a feature called variance that does essentially this, but in a slightly more organized way. So let's look at that. So if I want to use variance, instead of changing the value of these variables depending on the state, I can just define one big object with all the visual variance for a frame. So for each variant of this component, I'm defining the visual properties for my toggle frame. So my switch has 2 variants, on and off, but it could have as many as I want, and I can name them whatever I want. So I called these on and off, but I could call them active and inactive, or open and closed, or I could add more variants, maybe one for a disabled state. But the cool thing is, since these different visual states have names now, I can animate to these values by just using the names instead of passing around these objects themselves. So first I tell the frame what are all the possible variants I might use, which are all defined in this toggle variance constant. So I just set that constant as the variance property on the frame, and then I can just animate to whichever variant I want by name. So in my animate property, I could just pass the string name of the variant I want to animate to. So you can see on the right, it just animated to the on property because I changed this to on. Of course, I still want that to be determined by my state variable. I don't want to just hard code the on variant in there. So I'll create a variable called current variant and have that based on my isOn state variable. And then I'll use that current variant variable in my animate property. So now I still have an animating toggle when I click. So all I did was define both of the possible variants in this constant called toggle variance. I set that on my toggle frame, and then depending on my state variable is on, I will set a string for the name of the variant I want to display, and I can pass that string name to the animate property, and it will animate to the variant with that name. So now I'll just do the same thing for my background frame. So first I'll create the variants for that frame. And then I'll send those variants to the background frame so it knows what all the possible variants are. So I do that through the variants property. And then I'll animate to the variant name that is stored in my current variant variable. And now when I click, I should see all three of those properties animating together. And I actually don't even need this animate property on the toggle frame, since the toggle frame is a child of the background frame. It's contained by the background frame. It will inherit the variant name from the parent frame if I don't specify it. So I can just delete this on the toggle frame and everything will still work. So where did we end up here? We saw that I can animate a property just by specifying the property and value in an object, and I can pass that to the animate property of a frame. That's what we did first. But I can also specify variants for a frame using the variants property. And variants are named objects that define the visual properties for my frame for different states. And then I can animate to those different variants by simply specifying the name of the variant that I want to animate to.